First of all, let me calm down. Is there any historian here? Anybody came from post-communistic country? You?
Yes.
Something. Poland?
Croatia.
Something will be familiar to you, of course. So, as you see, we had research on the 50s, the so-called 50s, what had a special meaning for the Hungarians because of the events what was there at that time. Among some forensics experts, we were involved in a historical research that started recently. 5 to 10 years after the Second World War were not enough to stabilize the Soviet-type state rules in Hungary. It was not the Hungarian people who decided to join to build the communism countries. The inner stress for the freedom led to a revolution and freedom war in the center of Europe in 1956. After the outbreak of it, the anti-democratic state power starts acts on the so-called guilties. It needs almost 70 years for the scientists to get started to have a green sign to research those years, those politically highly influenced trials. Our working group consists of psychologists, historians, and lawyers. This research work in the literature can also lead to a better understanding and interpretation of the forensic expert opinions made in the political trials of the 1915s in Hungary. It is therefore worth reviewing the history of Hungarian judicial expertise in addition to analyzing the sources. With the help of our study, they can gain an insight into the history of expertise, the legal backgrounds, and the various cultural and social influences. Judicial expertise is such a specialized field that not all medical doctors and psychologists study it, at most tangentially, so it can be interesting for professionals as well. This study was prepared at the Károly Gáspár Reformed University, one of the oldest universities in Hungary, under the title Political Trials in Hungary in the second half of the 20th century, at the request and support of the leader of the interdisciplinary research group. The revolution. So let me tell you what happened in Hungary in 1956. It was a revolution and a war of independence. What was a nationwide revolution against the policies imposed by the Hungarian People's Republic and the Soviet Union. The revolution began with a student demonstration that drew thousands as it marched through central Budapest to the parliament building. The protesters tried to announce their demands, but the Hungarian security service opened fire on them from the roof of the buildings. After it, of course, the demonstration went into the fight. After the outbreak of the 1956 revolution in Hungary, many young people as well as teenagers were prosecuted for political reasons. The police and authorities acted harshly against those who stood up for the ideals of the revolutions. During the trials, many adolescents were convicted and sentenced to long prison terms. Who were the political enemies? These young guys, of course. Because in the eyes of the authorities and the police, those teenagers who participated in the revolution or supported the ideals of the revolution were political opponents, enemies. The accusations against them were often unfounded and politically motivated. As a result, many young people lost their freedom and future. But let's direct our attention to the lawsuits. and the expert work taking place in them. Precisely defining forensic psychology is a challenge, as this branch is located between two sciences of a completely different nature, law and psychology. Based on the literature, however, it can be stated is in the simplest way that the activity performed by a specialist psychologist, which helps the decision making of the court proceedings and the administration of justice, is classified as forensic expert activity. In an international sense, we have to place the beginnings of the forensic psychology back in 1879, when Wilhelm Wundt, one of the first psychologists in the history, founded a laboratory in Germany. It was then that investigations into the relationships between crime and human nature began. Raymond Cato, an English-born research psychologist, began to conduct studies on the psychology of testimony, where the results showed that despite the fact that witnesses were sure of what they say, they made quite a lot of mistakes in their testimonies. Similar research was continued later, but forensic psychology did not develop to a large extent until much later and became an independent science. What was happens during these decades in Hungary? Hungarian forensic psychology began to develop late compared to more Western countries. 100 years ago, in the 1920s, the popularity of criminal psychology and forensic psychology began almost everywhere in the world. In Hungary, we started at the same time, but the development was much slower. Unfortunately, only a few specialized literature and studies on criminal psychology were published in the first decades of the 20th century. Among these, one of the first were from Sándor Ferenc's work, entitled Psychoanalysis and its Legal and Social Assessment, and Psychoanalysis and Criminality. As we can see, the psychoanalysis has a strong bond to Sigmund Freud, who was a co-worker. Ferenc was a co-worker of Freud, of course. In the 1950s in Hungary represent a special period from the point of view of forensic psychology, which was deeply influenced by political and social changes. In the mid-20th century, the construction of the communist system and the Stalinist political orientations dominated, which affected the judicial system and its functioning. Political ideology penetrated scientific research and limited the topics that could contradict the official position. Some words about the political lawsuits. After the suppression of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution and freedom struggle, the communist regime condemned the participants of the events in numerous trials in which psychiatry also played a role. After the suppression of the Hungarian Revolution, the communist regime used a number of tools in its action against the revolutionaries and their sympathizers. Prominent among these tools were psychiatric evolutions, which were used for political purposes. Psychiatric interventions serves two main purposes. One, on the hand, they try to delegitimize the ideological foundations of the revolution by pathologizing the revolutionaries' mental state. On the other hand, they try to isolate and intimidate those who were deemed dangerous to the regime by placing them in psychiatric institutions. In this context, unfortunately, the Hungarian psychiatry became a tool for the political repressions. During the judicial processes, psychiatric expert opinions often supported sentences requiring psychiatric treatment of convicts, often without identifying actual psychiatric disorders. The psychiatric approaches used in the 1956 trials had a long-term impact on Hungarian society and the field of psychiatry nowadays too. Their use for political purposes raises questions about psychiatric ethics and abuse of political power. In these trials, there were frequent cases where the mental state of the defendants was examined, especially when the defense tried to reduce or exclude criminal responsibility based on mental disturbance for jurors. The expert opinions seen during the joint research with the working group illustrate the expertise of the political trials taking place during the communist dictatorship. From adult professional opinions, I highlight here as examples. It is important to state at the outset that in all cases they are medical professional opinions, no psychologist was involved. Here I show 4 expert opinions with just appetizer, but what is the common characteristics of these expert opinions are the source selections reviewed are a maximum of 3 pages long. No psychological expert was involved. Exploration was not recorded. In the majority of cases, it was described that the person awaiting the death penalty can be counted, so it can be executed. This is a strong competence overshoot in terms of word usage. What are our initial findings? We can see that the history of judicial expertise shows a complex development curve, which can be interpreted in the context of scientific, legal, and social changes. From this focus, we can better understand the expert opinions made during the dictatorship. In addition, the evaluation of expert opinions and the analysis of legal processes would require an even longer process, which we did not have the opportunity to do within the scope of this study. So, further studies needed to finish it. Thank you for your attention.